In 1847, the records of Jefferson County, Alabama, show an unusual entry in the plantation ledgers of Thornfield Manor. Among the routine documentation of livestock, crop yields, and property transfers, there appears a single line that would later perplex historians. Samuel returned of own accord, 13th time. The entry was signed by Overseer Thomas Whitmore, whose handwriting betrayed an uncharacteristic tremor that day. Thornfield Manor sat on nearly 2,000 acres of rolling hills, 15 miles southeast of Birmingham, accessible only by a winding dirt road that cut through dense pine forests. The plantation house, an imposing two-story structure with white columns and wraparound porches, overlooked cotton fields that stretched to the horizon. Behind the main house stood the quarters, a collection of weathered wooden cabins arranged in neat rows, each housing multiple families under conditions that local church records would later describe as austere but orderly. The plantation belonged to Marcus Bellwether, a man whose wealth came not from cotton alone, but from his reputation as someone who could manage the unmanageable. Neighboring plantation owners would send their most troublesome cases to Bellwether, paying handsomely for his methods of maintaining order. What those methods entailed was never discussed in polite society, though whispered conversations in Birmingham drawing rooms suggested that Bellwether possessed an almost supernatural ability to break the spirit of even the most defiant individuals. Samuel first appeared in Bellwether's records in 1839 as part of an estate sale from a failed plantation near Huntsville. The previous owner, according to probate documents, had specifically noted that Samuel was intelligent beyond measure, literate despite prohibitions, and possessed of an unsettling persistence. Indeed, the warning proved prophetic within weeks of his arrival at Thornfield. The first escape occurred on a moonless night in September. Samuel simply vanished from his assigned cabin, leaving behind no trace of forced entry or struggle. Search parties with hunting dogs combed the surrounding forests for 3 days before giving up. Standard procedure would have been to alert neighboring counties and post notices, but Bellwether made no such efforts. He merely waited. 7 days after the disappearance, Overseer Whitmore discovered Samuel sitting calmly on the front steps of the main house at dawn, as if he had never left. When questioned about his whereabouts, Samuel provided no explanation. He submitted to punishment without resistance, then returned to his assigned duties as if nothing had occurred. The second escape followed an identical pattern 2 months later. Again, Samuel vanished without trace. Again, search efforts proved futile. Again, he returned exactly 7 days later, sitting in the same location at the same time of day, offering no account of his absence. This time, however, Whitmore noted something different. Samuel's clothes showed no signs of travel, no mud or wear that would indicate days spent in the wilderness. They appeared freshly laundered. By the fourth escape, word had begun to spread among the other plantation workers. Hushed conversations spoke of Samuel's ability to simply disappear, as if the earth itself swallowed him whole. Some claimed to have seen him in the fields during his supposed absences, working silently in areas where no work had been assigned. Others reported hearing his voice, calling out in languages that sounded nothing like English or any African dialect they recognized. Bellwether himself began to take notice after the sixth escape. Private letters to his brother in Montgomery, discovered decades later in a trunk in the family attic, reveal his growing frustration and something approaching genuine fear. "The man returns as punctually as sunrise," he wrote, "yet I cannot fathom where he goes or why he chooses to come back. It defies all logic and experience. The pattern continued with mechanical precision. Every 2 to 3 months, Samuel would vanish. 7 days later, he would reappear on the front steps of the main house. No amount of increased surveillance, chained doors, or guard rotations could prevent his departures. No tracking effort ever yielded so much as a footprint or broken branch to indicate his path through the wilderness. Local newspapers began to take notice by 1842. The Birmingham Herald published a brief item titled "The Phantom of Thornfield," though the article raised more questions than it answered. Editor Jonathan Mills wrote, "Reliable sources confirm the repeated disappearances of a plantation worker who returns without fail, yet offers no explanation for his absences. The phenomenon has attracted the attention of learned men who find no rational explanation for such behavior." What the newspapers did not report were the more disturbing aspects of Samuel's returns. According to testimony later given by former overseer Whitmore to a county magistrate, Samuel never appeared tired, hungry, or disheveled after his week-long absences. More unsettling still, he seemed to know things he should not have known, details about events that had occurred on the plantation during his absence, conversations held in private meetings, even the contents of letters that had arrived from distant locations. The other plantation workers began to exhibit signs of deep unease. Productivity declined as people found excuses to avoid working near Samuel. Evening gatherings in the quarters grew quiet when he appeared, and children stopped playing their usual games when he passed by. Church services conducted by traveling ministers noted unusually fervent prayers for protection from wandering spirits and those who walk between worlds. Bellwether's correspondence from this period reveals a man struggling to maintain his reputation while grappling with something beyond his understanding. In a letter dated March 1844, he wrote to his brother, "I have built my success on the principle that any man can be broken if sufficient pressure is applied. Yet this Samuel remains untouched by conventional methods. Worse still, I begin to suspect that he allows himself to be recaptured rather than truly returning against his will." The community's discomfort reached a breaking point during Samuel's 10th escape in the spring of 1845. This time, several plantation workers reported seeing him simultaneously in multiple locations during the 7 days he was supposed to be missing. A field hand named Moses swore he saw Samuel working in the cotton fields at midday, yet when Moses approached, no one was there. A house servant claimed to have served Samuel his evening meal, only to remember later that he was supposed to be gone. These reports prompted Bellwether to take more drastic measures. He hired a professional tracker, a man named Isaiah Crow, who had earned a fearsome reputation for his ability to find runaway slaves across 3 states. Crow arrived at Thornfield in June 1845, bringing with him a pack of specially trained hunting dogs and equipment for an extended pursuit. When Samuel disappeared for the 11th time, Crow was ready. Within hours of the discovery, he and his dogs were following a scent trail that led deep into the pine forests surrounding the plantation. For the first time, there seemed to be genuine hope of solving the mystery. Crow's confidence was absolute. He had never failed to track a fugitive, and his dogs had never lost a scent. 3 days into the pursuit, Crow's dogs became agitated and refused to continue. The tracker himself reported feeling disoriented, as if the forest itself was shifting around him. He claimed the scent trail led in impossible directions, sometimes seeming to go straight up the trunks of trees, other times disappearing entirely, only to reappear yards away in a completely different direction. On the 4th day of the search, Crow made a discovery that he would never fully explain in his official report. Deep in the forest, he found a clearing that appeared on no maps of the area. In the center of this clearing stood what he described as structures of unknown origin, constructions of wood and stone that showed clear signs of human habitation but followed no architectural patterns he recognized. Crow's written report, filed with the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, described finding evidence of recent occupation, cold ashes from cooking fires, marks in the earth suggesting regular movement of multiple people, and most disturbing of all, carved symbols on the surrounding trees that appeared fresh, despite following patterns that seemed ancient. When pressed for more details, Crow would only say that he had seen things in that clearing that no Christian man should witness. The professional tracker abandoned his pursuit on the 5th day, claiming his dogs had become too distressed to continue. He left Thornfield Manor immediately, refusing payment and advising Bellwether to leave well enough alone. When Samuel returned on schedule 2 days later, Crow was already 50 miles away, having departed Alabama entirely. Bellwether's letters from this period show a marked change in tone. The confident plantation owner who had prided himself on solving difficult problems now wrote of sleepless nights and growing paranoia. "I begin to question whether Samuel is the problem," he confided to his brother, "or merely a symptom of something far more troubling that has taken root on this land." The 12th escape occurred in the dead of winter, 1846. By this time, the regular pattern had become so established that the plantation workers simply adjusted their routines to account for Samuel's weekly absences. Overseer Whitmore stopped filing formal reports, and the hired guards were instructed to ignore the empty cabin during Samuel's predictable departures. Yet this 12th disappearance brought an unexpected development. On the 3rd day of Samuel's absence, a traveling preacher named Reverend Elijah Stone arrived at Thornfield Manor, claiming to have received word that spiritual intervention was needed. Stone was known throughout northern Alabama for his work with what he called troubled souls, people whose behavior defied conventional explanation. Reverend Stone spent 4 days at Thornfield, conducting what he termed consultations with various workers and examining the quarters where Samuel lived. His conclusions, recorded in a letter to the Southern Baptist Convention, were deeply troubling. "I have found evidence of practices that contradict all Christian teaching. The man, Samuel, is but one member of a larger group that has found ways to move freely despite physical constraints. What we are witnessing is not escape in any conventional sense, but rather a form of existence that operates outside natural law." The Reverend's letter went on to describe discoveries that church officials would later classify as too sensitive for general distribution. Stone reported finding hidden chambers beneath several of the quarters' cabins, connected by tunnels that extended far beyond the plantation boundaries. More disturbing still, he claimed to have encountered other individuals during his investigation, people who appeared to be plantation workers during daylight hours, but gathered in the underground spaces for purposes that Stone described as abhorrent to civilized society. Stone's investigation was cut short when Samuel returned from his 12th absence. The Reverend left Thornfield immediately, but not before leaving behind a sealed letter addressed to whoever might have authority to act. The letter disappeared from Bellwether's possession within days of Stone's departure, though copies may have been made before its disappearance. The pattern of escapes and returns continued through 1846, but the atmosphere at Thornfield had changed irrevocably. Other plantation owners began to avoid doing business with Bellwether, citing vague concerns about the reliability of his operation. Workers from neighboring plantations refused assignments that would bring them to Thornfield property. Even the traveling merchants who supplied remote plantations began to find excuses to skip their regular routes past the manor. By early 1847, Bellwether had become increasingly isolated. His correspondence with family members grew erratic, filled with rambling observations about the nature of free will, and the possibility that some forms of bondage were merely illusions. His handwriting, once precise and authoritative, became increasingly erratic. His younger brother wrote back expressing concern about Marcus's mental state and suggesting he consider selling the plantation. The 13th and final recorded escape occurred on a humid night in June 1847. This time, however, something was different. Samuel did not simply vanish from his cabin. He was observed walking openly across the plantation grounds by multiple witnesses, including Overseer Whitmore and 2 hired guards. He made no attempt at concealment, moving with deliberate purpose toward the main house. Whitmore's final report, discovered years later among county records, provides a chilling account of what followed. Samuel approached the front door of the main house and stood there for several minutes, apparently waiting. When Bellwether emerged to confront him, Samuel spoke for the first time since his initial arrival 8 years earlier. According to Whitmore, who observed from a distance, the conversation lasted nearly an hour, though no words could be heard clearly enough to understand. At the conclusion of their discussion, Samuel turned and walked toward the tree line. Bellwether made no move to stop him, instead remaining on the front porch watching until Samuel disappeared into the forest. That was the last time anyone at Thornfield Manor saw Marcus Bellwether alive. The plantation owner's body was discovered 7 days later, seated in his study chair as if he had simply fallen asleep while reading. The county physician found no signs of violence or illness that could account for his death. His personal papers were found scattered across the floor, though none appeared to be missing. Most puzzling of all, the study door was locked from the inside, with the key still in Bellwether's pocket. True to pattern, Samuel returned exactly 7 days after his departure, appearing on the front steps of the main house at dawn, as he had so many times before. But this time, there was no one to note his arrival. Overseer Whitmore had abandoned the plantation during the night after Bellwether's funeral, leaving behind only a hastily scrawled note stating that he could no longer serve in good conscience. With no overseer and no owner, Thornfield Manor began its rapid decline. The remaining workers dispersed to other plantations or simply disappeared into the surrounding countryside. Within months, the once prosperous operation had been reduced to empty buildings and overgrown fields. County records show that the property was eventually sold for back taxes, though the buyer's identity was obscured by a complex series of legal transfers. Samuel himself vanished during this period of chaos, not in his usual pattern of temporary absence, but completely and finally. Some claimed to have seen him walking the roads toward Birmingham. Others insisted he had joined groups of travelers heading west toward Mississippi. A few maintained that he had never left at all, but continued to live somewhere on the abandoned plantation grounds, invisible to casual observation, but occasionally glimpsed by those who knew where to look. The tunnels that Reverend Stone had reported were never officially investigated. By the time county authorities might have taken interest, the abandoned plantation had been stripped of anything valuable by scavengers, and the underground passages had either collapsed or been deliberately sealed. Local residents developed the habit of avoiding the Thornfield property entirely, preferring to take longer routes that circumvented the boundaries of the former plantation. In 1851, a group of northern missionaries attempted to establish a school on the Thornfield property, believing the large buildings could be converted for educational purposes. Their effort lasted less than 3 months before being abandoned. The missionaries' reports cited persistent structural problems and unsuitable atmospheric conditions, though private letters sent to their sponsors in Boston mentioned strange sounds emanating from beneath the buildings and the discovery of rooms that appeared on no architectural plans. The final official mention of Samuel appears in a railroad survey conducted in 1858, workers laying track for the planned Birmingham to Montgomery line reported encountering a tall black man who seemed to know intimate details about the terrain and offered to guide them around obstacles that were not visible to the surveyors themselves. The man identified himself only as Samuel and disappeared each evening, returning the following dawn to continue his assistance. The railroad workers' foreman noted that Samuel's guidance proved invaluable, helping them avoid areas where the ground was unstable or where water tables would make construction difficult. Yet he also reported feeling uneasy about their mysterious helper, particularly after discovering that Samuel's knowledge of the landscape seemed to extend to areas that had been dramatically altered since the abandonment of Thornfield Manor. He speaks of landmarks that no longer exist, the foreman wrote, and warns of dangers in places that appear perfectly safe to experienced eyes. When the railroad section was completed, Samuel simply failed to appear one morning. The workers found a note pinned to a tree where he had typically waited each dawn. The note, written in an educated hand, thanked them for their courtesy and wished them well in future endeavors. It was signed Samuel of Thornfield and included a warning. Those who seek what lies beneath should remember that some doors once opened change the nature of what passes through them. The abandoned plantation continued to decay throughout the 1850s and 60s. Occasionally, travelers reported seeing lights moving through the ruins at night, or hearing sounds that suggested ongoing habitation despite the obvious emptiness of the buildings. These reports became less frequent over time, though they never ceased entirely. By the time of the war between the states, Thornfield Manor had acquired a local reputation that discouraged all but the most desperate from seeking shelter among its ruins. During the war years, the property served briefly as a way station for various groups moving through the area, though none stayed long. Confederate deserters, Union scouts, and displaced civilians all reported similar experiences, a sense of being watched by unseen observers, the discovery of recently used campsites in areas they had believed to be uninhabited, and encounters with individuals who seemed to know more about their circumstances than should have been possible. One particularly detailed account comes from a Union cavalry officer who spent 3 days at Thornfield in 1863 while his unit recovered from an engagement near Birmingham. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison documented his experiences in letters to his wife, describing the plantation as a place where the normal rules of cause and effect seemed to operate under different principles. Morrison reported finding evidence of recent occupation in buildings that showed no signs of maintenance, discovering food stores that should have spoiled years earlier, and encountering a man who matched descriptions of the legendary Samuel. According to Morrison's account, this individual approached his camp on the second night, emerging from the ruins of the main house as if he had been waiting for an appropriate moment to make contact. The man offered information about Confederate troop movements in the area, intelligence that proved accurate when verified by Morrison's scouts. In exchange, he asked only for news from the outside world, particularly regarding changes in federal policy concerning freed slaves. Morrison described his informant as a person of evident education and refinement, whose manner of speaking suggested familiarity with legal and political concepts beyond what one might expect from his circumstances. The officer was particularly struck by the man's detailed knowledge of events occurring hundreds of miles away, information that would have been difficult for anyone in his position to obtain through conventional means. When Morrison's unit prepared to depart on the third day, their mysterious helper provided them with detailed maps of safe routes through Confederate-held territory. These maps proved so accurate that Morrison was able to rejoin his regiment without casualties, an outcome he attributed directly to the intelligence provided by the man he believed to be Samuel. In his final letter about the encounter, Morrison wrote, "I am convinced I met the individual who has become something of a legend in this region. Whether his abilities stem from an extraordinary network of informants or from sources beyond conventional explanation, I cannot say. I can only report that his assistance likely saved the lives of my men." The end of the war brought new visitors to Thornfield Manor, as former slaves throughout the region sought information about family members who had been sold or transferred during the preceding decades. Many hoped that the records kept by Marcus Bellwether might contain clues about the whereabouts of separated relatives. However, efforts to locate and examine these records proved futile. The plantation's files had apparently been removed or destroyed during the years of abandonment. Some visitors reported success in their searches despite the absence of official records. A pattern emerged of people arriving at Thornfield seeking information about lost family members, only to encounter helpful strangers who possessed detailed knowledge about slave sales and transfers from the plantation's operational period. These encounters typically occurred near the ruins of the overseer's house, where someone would emerge from the shadows to offer specific details about when certain individuals had been sold and to which plantations they had been sent. The accuracy of this information was consistently verified when relatives followed up on the leads they received. Families were reunited across multiple states based on intelligence provided by these mysterious sources at Thornfield. Yet when grateful family members attempted to return to thank their benefactors, they found only empty ruins and no trace of recent habitation. Local church records from the immediate post-war period document several instances of freed slaves making pilgrimages to Thornfield Manor, claiming to have received dreams or visions directing them to return. These individuals typically spent several days camping among the ruins before departing with apparent satisfaction. Though they rarely discussed what they had accomplished during their visits, pastors noted that these pilgrims often spoke of settling old business and achieving a sense of closure that had eluded them since gaining their freedom. By the 1870s, the legend of Samuel had evolved into something approaching myth throughout Jefferson County. Parents used stories of the man who could not be held to teach children about the importance of determination and the power of knowledge. Yet these same stories carried warnings about the dangers of seeking power through unnatural means, suggesting that Samuel's abilities had come at a price that others should not attempt to pay. The first serious historical investigation of the Thornfield phenomenon occurred in 1876, when Professor Edward Whitfield of the University of Alabama undertook a comprehensive study of antebellum plantation records. Whitfield's research, intended to document the economic impact of large-scale agriculture in northern Alabama, led him to examine surviving documents from dozens of plantations, including some papers from Thornfield Manor that had been preserved in county archives. Whitfield's initial findings confirmed the basic outline of Samuel's story. The repeated escapes, the punctual returns, and the growing unease among plantation personnel. However, his research also uncovered discrepancies that suggested the true situation had been more complex than popular accounts indicated. Cross-referencing records from neighboring plantations, Whitfield discovered multiple references to individuals with similar abilities operating throughout the region during the same time period. A plantation near Tuscaloosa reported a worker who disappeared regularly, but always returned with knowledge of events occurring in distant locations. An operation in Walker County documented a man who seemed to age more slowly than his contemporaries, and possessed an uncanny ability to predict weather patterns weeks in advance. Most intriguingly, records from a plantation in Blount County described a woman who could apparently communicate with workers on other plantations, despite the distances involved, coordinating escapes and resistance activities across a network spanning hundreds of square miles. Whitfield's research suggested that Samuel had not been an isolated phenomenon, but rather part of a larger network of individuals who had developed extraordinary capabilities for moving and communicating across the heavily controlled landscape of antebellum Alabama. His preliminary conclusions, presented to a historical society meeting in 1877, proposed that the legend of Samuel represented evidence of a sophisticated underground organization that had operated throughout the region during the slavery period. The professor's work was cut short when he disappeared while conducting research at the Thornfield site in November 1877. His colleagues found his camp intact, with his notes and research materials undisturbed, but no trace of Whitfield himself. Search parties combed the area for weeks without success. His disappearance was eventually attributed to an accident, possibly a fall into one of the old wells on the property, though his body was never recovered. Whitfield's research materials were donated to the University of Alabama Library, where they remained largely unexamined until 1894. At that time, a graduate student named Margaret Thornton began working with the papers as part of a thesis on plantation economics. Thornton's work revealed additional layers to the Thornfield mystery that Whitfield had not had time to fully explore. Among Whitfield's notes, Thornton found references to a series of land purchases made in the decades following the abandonment of Thornfield Manor. Small parcels of the original plantation had been quietly acquired by buyers whose identities were obscured by complex legal arrangements. These purchases followed no obvious pattern, consisting of scattered plots that seemed to have no economic value. Yet when Thornton plotted their locations on a map, she discovered that they corresponded precisely to the sites where underground passages had been reported by various investigators over the years. Thornton's research also uncovered evidence that the network of extraordinary individuals documented by Whitfield had continued to operate after the end of slavery. Railroad records, newspaper reports, and legal documents from the Reconstruction era contained scattered references to mysterious helpers who assisted freed slaves in locating family members, finding employment, and navigating the complex legal challenges of their new status. These helpers appeared to possess the same uncanny knowledge of distant events and ability to move undetected that had characterized Samuel and his contemporaries. The graduate student's investigations led her to attempt direct contact with surviving members of what she had come to call the Thornfield Network. Working through churches and community organizations throughout northern Alabama, she put out word that she was seeking information about individuals who had possessed unusual capabilities during the slavery period. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of elderly African Americans came forward with stories about relatives or community members who had exhibited extraordinary abilities. These interviews, conducted throughout 1895 and 1896, revealed a consistent pattern. The individuals in question had typically been highly intelligent slaves who had somehow acquired literacy and extensive knowledge despite the legal prohibitions against education. They had demonstrated abilities that seemed to transcend normal human limitations: exceptional memory, uncanny intuition about distant events, and most significantly, the capacity to move freely despite physical constraints. Yet Thornton's informants also spoke of these individuals with a mixture of respect and wariness. They were remembered as valuable allies who had helped countless people during the darkest periods of slavery and Reconstruction. But they were also described as somehow apart from normal human community, as if their extraordinary capabilities had come at the cost of conventional human connection. Several of Thornton's sources claimed that members of the network were still active in the 1890s, though they had adapted their methods to the changed circumstances of post-war Alabama. These individuals allegedly continued to assist African Americans facing discrimination or violence, providing information about safe travel routes, warning of impending dangers, and helping to coordinate resistance to the emerging Jim Crow laws. Thornton's thesis, completed in 1897, represented the most comprehensive academic study of the Thornfield phenomenon ever undertaken. Her conclusion was both startling and carefully hedged. She proposed that the legend of Samuel and similar figures represented evidence of a sophisticated resistance network that had operated continuously from the antebellum period through Reconstruction and into the present day. This network, she argued, had developed techniques for communication and movement that appeared supernatural to outside observers, but were actually based on carefully developed skills and extensive planning. The thesis was accepted by her graduate committee, but never published in academic journals. University officials expressed concerns about the implications of Thornton's research, particularly her suggestions that organized resistance to white authority had been far more extensive and sophisticated than previously recognized. The completed work was placed in the university archives, where it remained largely inaccessible to researchers for several decades. Margaret Thornton herself left Alabama shortly after completing her degree, accepting a teaching position at a college for women in Massachusetts. She continued her research into networks of resistance during slavery, but focused her published work on better documented examples from other regions. Her papers, donated to the Schlesinger Library at Harvard upon her death in 1932, contain extensive notes about the Thornfield investigation, including maps, interview transcripts, and copies of documents that have since disappeared from other archives. The Thornfield property itself continued to deteriorate throughout the early 20th century. The main house, which had survived the war and decades of abandonment, finally collapsed during a severe storm in 1908. The ruins were gradually reclaimed by forest growth, leaving only scattered foundation stones and the occasional artifact to mark the location where Marcus Bellwether had once ruled over hundreds of acres and dozens of lives. Yet reports of unusual activity in the area persisted. Local residents, both white and black, continued to speak of lights moving through the trees where Thornfield had once stood. Hunters reported encountering individuals who seemed to appear and disappear without warning, offering directions or warnings about dangerous terrain before vanishing back into the forest. These encounters followed the same pattern that had characterized meetings with Samuel during the antebellum period. Helpful strangers who possessed inexplicable knowledge and left observers with more questions than answers. During the Great Depression, the area around the former Thornfield plantation became a refuge for unemployed workers and displaced families. People camping in the ruins reported that they were sometimes approached by individuals offering food or information about work opportunities in distant locations. Those who followed these leads typically found employment exactly where they had been directed, though efforts to locate their benefactors for the purpose of expressing gratitude invariably proved unsuccessful. These Depression-era encounters were documented by federal workers conducting surveys of rural conditions in Alabama. Their reports, filed with the Works Progress Administration, described a pattern of assistance being provided to destitute families by sources that could not be identified or contacted through normal means. The WPA investigators noted that recipients of this aid were reluctant to discuss the details of their experiences, offering only general statements about helpful people who had provided assistance during times of need. World War II brought new attention to the Thornfield area when the federal government conducted surveys of potential military training sites throughout Alabama. Army engineers examining the terrain discovered extensive evidence of underground passages and chambers that had not been documented in previous investigations. These findings prompted a more thorough archaeological survey conducted in 1943 under military auspices. The survey team, led by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes, uncovered a network of tunnels and chambers that extended far beyond what had been suspected by earlier investigators. The passages showed evidence of sophisticated construction techniques, with stone-lined walls and drainage systems that had kept them intact despite decades of abandonment. Most significantly, the tunnels connected the former Thornfield site to locations throughout a 50-square-mile area, creating a transportation network that would have allowed rapid and undetected movement across the entire region. Hayes's team also discovered evidence that the underground network had been used continuously from the antebellum period through the early 20th century. Artifacts found in the chambers spanned multiple decades and included items that could be dated to the slavery period, Reconstruction, and the early 1900s. The archaeological evidence supported Margaret Thornton's hypothesis that an organized network had operated in the area for an extended period, though the military investigators drew different conclusions about the nature and purpose of this organization. The Army's final report, classified upon completion, concluded that the Thornfield network represented a security concern that required ongoing monitoring. Military intelligence officers noted that the sophistication of the underground system suggested capabilities that went beyond anything that should have been possible for enslaved or recently freed African Americans to accomplish without outside assistance. They recommended continued surveillance of the area and investigation of possible connections to foreign intelligence services. This recommendation led to periodic monitoring of the Thornfield site by federal agencies throughout the Cold War period. FBI files, partially released under Freedom of Information Act requests in the 1980s, document sporadic investigations of reported activities in the area. These files contain references to individuals who seemed to possess unusual knowledge about federal operations and who appeared to be coordinating resistance to various government policies, though no arrests were ever made and no concrete evidence of subversive activity was ever documented. The most recent serious investigation of the Thornfield phenomenon occurred in 1962, when civil rights researchers examining the historical roots of resistance movements in Alabama encountered references to the Samuel legend. Dr. James Washington, a professor at Tuskegee Institute, became intrigued by the parallels between antebellum accounts of the mysterious plantation worker and contemporary reports of individuals who seemed to possess extraordinary abilities to coordinate civil rights activities across the region. Washington's research revealed that many of the most successful civil rights campaigns in Alabama had been assisted by advisors who possessed detailed knowledge of local conditions and uncanny insight into the strategies being developed by segregationist opposition. These advisors typically appeared at crucial moments, provided valuable intelligence or guidance, then disappeared before they could be identified or questioned by hostile authorities. Their assistance often proved decisive in the success of voter registration drives, desegregation efforts, and other civil rights activities. The professor's attempts to identify and interview these mysterious helpers met with the same frustrations that had plagued earlier investigators. People who had been assisted were reluctant to discuss the details of their experiences, offering only vague descriptions of helpful strangers who had appeared when needed most. Even when Washington was able to obtain more specific information, efforts to locate the individuals in question proved unsuccessful. Washington's research was interrupted when he disappeared while conducting interviews in Jefferson County in August 1962. His car was found abandoned on a rural road near the former Thornfield site, with his research notes scattered throughout the interior. Despite extensive searches by both law enforcement and civil rights organizations, Washington was never found. His disappearance was widely attributed to violence by segregationist extremists, though no evidence of foul play was ever discovered. The professor's research materials were preserved by colleagues at Tuskegee Institute, where they remained until 1987. At that time, Washington's notes were examined by Dr. Angela Morrison, a historian researching the role of community networks in the civil rights movement. Morrison's work revealed the most comprehensive documentation of the Thornfield phenomenon ever assembled, spanning nearly a century and a half of reported encounters with extraordinary individuals in the Jefferson County area. Morrison's analysis of the accumulated evidence led her to propose a radically different interpretation of the Samuel legend. Rather than viewing the phenomenon as evidence of supernatural abilities or foreign intelligence operations, she argued that the reports documented the activities of a multi-generational organization that had developed sophisticated techniques for operating undetected within hostile territory. This organization, she suggested, represented the institutional memory of resistance to oppression, passing knowledge and capabilities from generation to generation through carefully maintained networks of communication and training. According to Morrison's hypothesis, the individuals who appeared at crucial moments throughout Alabama history were members of an organization that had originated during the slavery period and had continuously adapted its methods to changing circumstances. The apparent supernatural abilities attributed to these individuals were actually the result of exceptional training, extensive intelligence networks, and carefully planned operations that created the illusion of superhuman capabilities. Morrison's research also suggested that the organization's influence extended far beyond Alabama, with similar networks operating throughout the Southeast during the slavery period and continuing their activities into the modern civil rights era. She documented connections between the Thornfield phenomenon and reported cases of extraordinary individuals in Georgia, Mississippi, and Tennessee, arguing that these represented components of a regional resistance network that had operated continuously for more than a century. The historian's conclusions were presented at an academic conference in 1988, where they generated considerable controversy among scholars of African American history. Some colleagues praised Morrison's work as a groundbreaking contribution to understanding the institutional aspects of resistance to slavery and segregation. Others criticized her methodology and questioned the reliability of the oral history sources that formed the foundation of her research. Morrison's own research came to an abrupt end when she was denied tenure at her university in 1989. Official reasons cited concerns about the scholarly rigor of her work, but private communications among faculty members suggested that university administrators had received pressure from unidentified sources to discontinue research into the Thornfield phenomenon. Morrison left academic life entirely, taking a position with a non-profit organization focused on community development in urban areas. The most recent documented encounter with the phenomenon occurred in 1993, when a team of graduate students from the University of Alabama attempted to conduct a comprehensive archaeological survey of the former Thornfield site. The students, working under the supervision of Professor Michael Chen, planned to use ground-penetrating radar and other modern techniques to map the underground network that had been partially explored by earlier investigators. The team's equipment detected extensive subsurface structures that confirmed the existence of a complex tunnel system beneath the former plantation. However, their attempts to access these passages were repeatedly frustrated by equipment failures and what they described as atmospheric disturbances that made accurate readings impossible. After 3 weeks of investigation, the team had made little progress in documenting the underground network. On their final night at the site, several team members reported encountering an elderly African-American man who emerged from the forest and approached their camp. The individual identified himself only as a caretaker and expressed interest in their research. According to the students' accounts, the man possessed detailed knowledge about the history of the plantation and seemed familiar with the academic literature about the Samuel phenomenon. The encounter lasted approximately 2 hours, during which the mysterious visitor provided the students with information about the underground network that proved more accurate than anything they had discovered through their own investigations. He described the layout of passages they had not yet located, explained the purpose of chambers they had detected but not accessed, and offered insights into the construction techniques that had been used to create the system. When the students asked how he had acquired such detailed knowledge, the man explained that he was a descendant of people who had worked at Thornfield during its operational period. He claimed that information about the plantation and its underground network had been preserved through oral tradition within certain families, passed down from generation to generation, along with the responsibility for maintaining the site. Professor Chen, who was present during part of this conversation, later wrote that the individual's knowledge seemed to extend beyond what could reasonably be attributed to oral tradition alone. The man provided specific details about construction techniques and architectural features that would have required direct observation or access to detailed technical documents. He also demonstrated familiarity with the findings of previous investigators, including research that had never been published or made publicly available. When the students returned the next morning to continue their conversation, they found that their visitor had departed, leaving behind only a handwritten note thanking them for their interest in preserving historical accuracy. The note included precise directions to several previously unknown chambers in the underground network, along with warnings about structural instabilities that could pose dangers to inexperienced explorers. Following up on the information provided in the note, the research team was able to locate and document several previously unknown sections of the tunnel system. These discoveries confirmed the man's knowledge and provided new insights into the sophistication of the underground network. However, they also raised new questions about how such detailed information could have been preserved and transmitted across multiple generations. Professor Chen's final report on the project, submitted to the university in 1994, recommended continued investigation of the Thornfield site, but acknowledged the challenges posed by the apparent involvement of community members who possess detailed knowledge about the underground system. The report suggested that future research should involve collaboration with local residents who might be able to provide access to oral traditions and historical information not available through conventional academic sources. The recommendation for continued research was not implemented. Budget constraints and changing academic priorities led the university to focus its archaeological resources on other projects. The Thornfield site was designated as historically significant and protected from commercial development, but no further systematic investigation was undertaken. In the years since the 1993 survey, the former Thornfield plantation has remained largely undisturbed. The property is now part of a state forest preserve, accessible to hikers and researchers, but protected from development or major excavation. Occasional visitors report encounters with knowledgeable individuals who provide historical information or assistance with navigation, but these reports have not been formally investigated. The legend of Samuel continues to circulate in oral traditions throughout Jefferson County and surrounding areas. Different versions of the story emphasize various aspects of the phenomenon. Some focus on Samuel's apparent ability to escape and return at will. Others highlight his role in assisting other enslaved people. And still others suggest that he represented something larger than an individual, perhaps a symbol of resistance that transcended normal human limitations. Academic interest in the Thornfield phenomenon has waned since the unsuccessful investigation of 1993. Most scholars now view the Samuel legend as an example of folklore that developed around a historical figure whose actual capabilities were exaggerated over time through repeated retellings. The documented aspects of the story, the escapes, returns, and eventual disappearance, are generally accepted as historically accurate, while the more extraordinary claims are attributed to the natural tendency of oral tradition to embellish unusual events. Yet questions remain about aspects of the phenomenon that resist conventional explanation. The physical evidence of the underground network demonstrates capabilities that seem beyond what should have been possible for enslaved people to accomplish without outside assistance or resources. The consistent patterns in reported encounters across multiple decades suggest an organizational structure that transcends the lifespan of any individual. Most puzzling of all, the apparent continuation of activities at the site long after the original plantation was abandoned implies a level of institutional continuity that challenges assumptions about how such networks typically operate and evolve. Recent developments in understanding the history of resistance to slavery have provided new contexts for evaluating the Thornfield phenomenon. Research has revealed that networks of communication and assistance among enslaved people were far more sophisticated and extensive than previously recognized. The Underground Railroad, long understood as a primarily northern phenomenon, is now known to have included complex operations throughout the South that used techniques and resources that often seemed impossible to contemporary observers. Within this broader context, the Samuel legend appears less as an isolated anomaly and more as an example of resistance networks that operated throughout the slavery period. The extraordinary capabilities attributed to Samuel and similar individuals may represent not supernatural abilities, but rather the sophisticated techniques developed by highly organized resistance movements that needed to operate undetected within hostile territory. The most recent scholarly assessment of the Thornfield phenomenon, published in a historical journal in 2003, concluded that while many aspects of the Samuel legend remain unexplained, the core elements of the story are consistent with documented examples of resistance networks from other regions and time periods. The authors noted that the tendency to attribute supernatural explanations to sophisticated human organizations has been observed in many historical contexts, particularly when those organizations operated among populations that were denied access to education and formal institutions. This interpretation suggests that the legend of Samuel represents not evidence of extraordinary individuals, but rather testimony to the remarkable achievements of ordinary people who developed extraordinary capabilities in response to extraordinary circumstances. The underground network at Thornfield, the patterns of assistance and communication documented over multiple decades, and the apparent institutional continuity that transcended individual lifespans may all represent examples of human organization and achievement rather than supernatural phenomena. Yet even this rational interpretation leaves questions unanswered. The physical evidence at the Thornfield site continues to suggest engineering and organizational capabilities that seem beyond what should have been possible given the constraints under which enslaved people operated. The consistency of reported encounters across multiple generations implies a level of institutional continuity that challenges understanding of how such organizations typically develop and maintain themselves over extended periods. Perhaps most significantly, the apparent continuation of activities associated with the Thornfield network into the modern period suggests that whatever phenomenon the Samuel legend represents, it was not limited to the historical context of slavery. The reports of assistance provided to civil rights workers in the 1960s, the encounters documented by researchers in the 1990s, and the ongoing reports of unusual activities in the area all suggest that the underlying organizational structure or institutional memory that gave rise to the legend may continue to exist in some form. The former Thornfield plantation remains a site of interest to historians, folklorists, and visitors curious about one of Alabama's most persistent historical mysteries. The State Forest Preserve that now encompasses the property attracts hikers and researchers who hope to catch glimpses of the underground network or perhaps encounter descendants of the people who once operated within its passages. Most visitors find only the peaceful forests and scattered ruins that mark the location where Marcus Bellwether once attempted to control the uncontrollable. Yet occasionally, hikers report encounters that echo the patterns established more than a century and a half ago. Helpful strangers who appear without warning to provide assistance or information, then disappear before they can be properly thanked or questioned. These individuals are typically described as knowledgeable about local history and geography, possessing insights into the significance of various landmarks and features that most visitors would not recognize or understand. Whether these encounters represent meetings with descendants of the original Thornfield network, chance meetings with local residents who maintain oral traditions about the area's history, or something else entirely, they serve to keep alive the questions that have surrounded this location for generations. The legend of Samuel and the mystery of Thornfield Manor continue to challenge easy explanations, representing a historical puzzle that may never be completely solved. The story began with a single line in a plantation ledger. Samuel returned of own accord, 13th time. It has grown into a legend that spans multiple centuries and touches on fundamental questions about the nature of freedom, the power of human organization, and the ways in which extraordinary circumstances can produce extraordinary achievements. Whether viewed as evidence of supernatural abilities or remarkable human accomplishments, the phenomenon documented at Thornfield Manor remains one of the most compelling unsolved mysteries in Alabama history. The sound that still echoes through the forests of Jefferson County is not the clank of chains or the crack of whips, but rather the whisper of footsteps moving through hidden passages, the rustle of leaves concealing ancient secrets, and the quiet voices of those who chose to return rather than simply escape. In a place where freedom was thought to be impossible, someone discovered that the most effective form of resistance might not be running away, but rather developing the ability to disappear and reappear at will, moving between worlds while remaining accountable to neither. And perhaps in the end, that is the true lesson of Samuel's story, that the most dangerous person in any system of oppression is not the one who breaks free entirely, but the one who masters the art of appearing to be bound while remaining fundamentally ungovernable. For such a person becomes living proof that no cage can truly hold the human spirit, no matter how carefully constructed or ruthlessly maintained. The mystery of Thornfield Manor continues to haunt the Alabama countryside, a reminder that some stories resist conclusion and some questions may be more important than their answers.